Ben Shapiro had been invited to a Fox News town hall special on political accountability in Washington, and he arrived with the kind of swagger that comes from years of rapid-fire media appearances where nobody ever quite manages to corner him. The setup was simple: a panel discussion on congressional effectiveness, moderated questions from the audience, and 3 congressional representatives invited to defend their records. Representative Jasmine Crockett had accepted the invitation knowing exactly what was coming. She'd watched Shapiro's pattern for years: talk faster than the room can process, pivot before anyone can fact-check, declare victory while the other person is still formulating a response. Shapiro opened with what he clearly considered a devastating observation. He turned to Crockett with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and said, "With all due respect, Representative, you've been in Congress for less than 2 years. You've authored 0 legislation that's become law. You spend more time on social media than in committee hearings. This isn't politics. This is performance art for people who don't understand how government actually works." The audience, carefully selected to skew conservative, applauded. Shapiro leaned back in his chair with the satisfied posture of someone who believed the conversation was already over. "I've been analyzing political effectiveness for 15 years. I've interviewed senators, cabinet members, Supreme Court justices. So maybe instead of lecturing the rest of us about accountability, you should focus on learning how Congress actually functions." He gestured dismissively toward her with his pen, the kind of casual contempt that comes from genuinely believing the other person has nothing substantive to offer. Crockett didn't react. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the table in front of her, her expression neutral. She had a leather portfolio in front of her, unremarkable except for its thickness, maybe 2 inches of documents inside, divided by visible tabs. She hadn't opened it yet. The moderator asked Shapiro to elaborate on his critique of freshman representatives, and he did enthusiastically. He rattled off statistics about bill passage rates, talked about the importance of working quietly within committee structures, praised bipartisanship as the only path to meaningful legislation. "The problem with the progressive wing," he said, speaking faster now, fully in his element, "is that they think viral moments are accomplishments. They think dunking on Republicans on Twitter is the same thing as passing appropriations bills. It's fundamentally unserious. And the American people deserve better than Instagram activism masquerading as governance." The audience applauded again. Crockett still hadn't moved. When the moderator finally turned to her for a response, Crockett spoke quietly, almost gently. "Mr. Shapiro, I appreciate your analysis. 15 years is a long time to study Congress from the outside." She paused just long enough for that last word to land. "You mentioned legislation. That's a fair metric. So let's talk about what I've actually done in 22 months. She opened the portfolio with the deliberate care of someone handling evidence in a courtroom. The first document was a single sheet of paper with the official congressional seal visible at the top. "House Resolution 1284, she said. "Bipartisan resolution recognizing Juneteenth's significance to American labor history. Co-sponsored by 11 Republicans. Passed the House 397 to 12. You called my work performance art. This resolution is now part of the congressional record." She slid the paper across the table toward him. Shapiro glanced at it, started to speak, and she continued before he could. "But we're not done yet." The second document came out. This one was thicker, maybe 15 pages, stapled in the corner. "Amendment to H.R. 4820, the Defense Appropriations Bill. I authored Section 7, subsection C, which reallocates $120 million in Pentagon spending from legacy weapon systems to veteran mental health services. The amendment passed committee 28 to 14. It's currently law." She turned to a highlighted section and read aloud. "No funds appropriated under this act may be used for the acquisition of weapon systems designated obsolete by the Government Accountability Office until mental health service wait times for veterans are reduced to the federally mandated 20-day standard." She looked up at Shapiro. 11 Republican committee members voted yes. "Would you like their names?" The room had gone quieter. Shapiro's pen had stopped moving. "You said I spend more time on social media than in committee hearings," Crockett said. Her voice hadn't changed, still calm, still measured, but something colder had entered it now. "Let's test that." The third document was a spreadsheet printed on legal-size paper. "Congressional attendance records are public. I've attended 96% of committee hearings over the last 18 months. The national average for House members is 71%. I've attended every single Oversight Committee hearing, all 43 of them. I've submitted written questions to witnesses in 89% of those hearings." She turned the page so the moderator's camera could see it. Row after row of dates, committee names, attendance marked in green. "This isn't social media performance, Mr. Shapiro. This is the actual work you said I wasn't doing. She paused. Would you like me to compare your attendance record at the events you're paid to speak at? Because I have that data too. Shapiro leaned forward, attempting to regain control. Listen, I think this is exactly what I'm talking about. You're cherry-picking individual data points to avoid the larger question of legislative effectiveness. What about major bills? What about primary sponsorship? What about... Crockett interrupted him, which was unusual enough that the moderator actually looked startled. What about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act? She said. The fourth document came out, and this one made Shapiro visibly pause. It was over 100 pages, bound with a black clip with sticky tabs marking specific sections. You want to talk about major bills? This bill allocated $2 trillion in infrastructure spending. I wasn't the primary sponsor. I was a freshman. But I was the primary author of Section 11, the Historically Underserved Communities Broadband Initiative. She opened to a tabbed section. This section directs $65 billion in broadband infrastructure specifically to counties where more than 30% of residents lack reliable internet access. It includes enforcement mechanisms, accountability metrics, and job creation requirements for local hiring. She turned the binder so Shapiro could see the highlighted text. This section was opposed by 7 Republicans in committee. It passed anyway. It's federal law now. 14 million Americans in rural counties will have broadband access by 2027 because of language I wrote. She let that sit for a moment. You asked what I've accomplished in 2 years. This is what governing looks like when you do the homework. Shapiro's face had gone slightly red. He started to respond, stopped, started again. That's one section of a bill that was going to pass anyway. You didn't... Crockett cut him off again. One section that redirects $65 billion. One section that creates 18,000 jobs, according to the CBO estimate. One section that 7 members of your party tried to strip out and failed. She closed the binder. If that's performance art, I'd love to see your definition of actual work. The moderator tried to redirect the conversation, but Shapiro wasn't finished. He'd been publicly corrected, and his entire brand was built on never losing a debate on camera. Okay, he said, his voice faster now, clipped. Fine. You've done some work, but let's be honest about what you're really known for. You're known for viral confrontations. You're known for going after Republicans in hearings for applause. That's not serious legislating. That's theater. It was exactly the opening Crockett had been waiting for. She reached into the portfolio and pulled out the 5th document. This one was different, a thin folder, maybe 20 pages, with a printed label on the front that read, Oversight Hearing Transcripts, Pattern Analysis 2023-2024. You're right, Crockett said quietly. I do ask questions in oversight hearings. Let's talk about what happens when I do. She opened the folder. January 2023. Oversight hearing on Defense Department contractor spending. I asked then Secretary nominee Pete Hegseth about 3 generals who resigned under his leadership at Concerned Veterans for America. You know what happened? She looked directly at Shapiro. 23 seconds of silence. Documented. He couldn't answer. 2 weeks later, documents surfaced showing financial mismanagement that led to those resignations. She turned the page. April 2023. Budget hearing. I asked about Trump-owned properties charging Secret Service $1, $4 million over 4 years. The spokesperson called my numbers partisan. 3 days later, the Washington Post confirmed every dollar amount I'd cited using FOIA requests. She turned another page. June 2023. Hearing on family separation policies. I asked about the 545 children who still hadn't been reunited with their parents. I was told that number was disputed by multiple sources. It wasn't disputed. It was documented by the Office of Refugee Resettlement's own reports. Another page. September 2023. Financial disclosure hearing. I asked about a $2 billion Saudi investment in a Trump family fund 2 months after he left office. I was accused of spreading conspiracy theories. The investment was confirmed by SEC filings the same week. She closed the folder and slid it across the table to Shapiro. Every single question I've asked in an oversight hearing has been based on documents, reports, or public records. Every single one. That's not theater, Mr. Shapiro. That's congressional oversight. It's literally my job. The room was completely silent now. Shapiro picked up the folder, flipped through a few pages, and set it down. He opened his mouth to respond. Nothing came out immediately. He tried again. Those are individual hearings. You're talking about... He stopped. His hand went to his tie, adjusted it unnecessarily. The point I'm making is about the broader culture of... He stopped again. Crockett waited. 5 seconds. 10. The moderator glanced between them, unsure whether to intervene. Shapiro's jaw worked like he was trying to find the sentence that would let him recover. What I'm saying, he finally managed, is that there's a difference between asking questions and actually passing legislation that changes people's lives. Crockett leaned forward slightly. Her voice dropped even quieter, which somehow made it more devastating. Mr. Shapiro, you opened this conversation by telling me I didn't understand how Congress works. You said I'd pass zero meaningful legislation. You said I was performance art. She gestured at the 5 documents now spread across the table between them. I've shown you a bipartisan resolution that's congressional record, an amendment that's federal law and redirects $120 million to veteran mental health, attendance records that exceed the national average by 25%, a section of the infrastructure bill that allocates $65 billion and creates 18,000 jobs, and a pattern of oversight questions that have led to confirmed financial disclosures, policy changes, and accountability for family separation. She paused. You've been analyzing politics for 15 years from television studios. I've been doing the actual work for 22 months in the building where it happens. She let that sit in the air for a long moment. Shapiro's face had gone from red to pale. His hands were gripping the edge of the table. He looked at the moderator as if hoping for rescue, but the moderator was carefully reviewing his notes, clearly unwilling to intervene. I want to be very clear about something, Crockett continued. You didn't come here tonight to have a conversation about congressional effectiveness. You came here to dismiss me. You came here because you thought a freshman black woman from Texas would be an easy target for your usual routine. Talk fast, throw out assumptions, declare victory before anyone can respond. You didn't do your homework. She tapped the portfolio in front of her. I did mine. Shapiro finally found his voice again, but it had lost its earlier confidence. I think we can both agree that there's value in different approaches to... No, Crockett said simply. We can't both agree on that. Because your approach tonight was to lecture me about something you haven't done. You've never written a bill. You've never sat through a committee hearing. You've never had to build a bipartisan coalition to get an amendment through markup. You've never had to defend language in front of the CBO. You analyze Congress the way someone who's never played football analyzes the NFL. You know the stats. You don't know the game. She began gathering the documents back into her portfolio, methodically, giving each one a moment. Here's what I know about politics, Mr. Shapiro. Politics is showing up to every hearing even when there are no cameras. Politics is reading every page of a 2,000-page appropriations bill to find the place where you can insert language that creates jobs. Politics is asking questions that powerful people don't want to answer and backing those questions up with documents they can't deny. Politics is doing the work even when people like you say it doesn't count. She closed the portfolio. You said I should focus on learning how Congress works. I have learned. That's why I have these records. That's why I have these results. The moderator, sensing the segment was effectively over, tried to throw Shapiro a lifeline by asking about his upcoming book on institutional reform. Shapiro answered, but his voice had lost its machine gun cadence. He spoke in slower, more measured sentences. He didn't look at Crockett again. When the town hall wrapped 30 minutes later and the audience began filing out, Shapiro left the stage quickly, walking past the green room where the other panelists were gathering. He'd come in expecting a performance. He'd gotten a prosecutor. In the days that followed, the exchange went viral in exactly the way Crockett had anticipated. The clip of Shapiro's 23-second silence after she presented the 5th document became the most shared political moment of the week. Conservative media tried to spin it as an ambush. Progressive outlets called it a masterclass in preparation. But the people who watched the full 90-minute broadcast, the demographic that mattered most, the 55 to 70-year-old Americans who still believed documentation mattered, saw something simpler and more satisfying. They saw someone who'd been publicly dismissed calmly and systematically prove that the dismissal said more about the dismisser than the dismissed. Crockett's office received 14,000 emails in the 3 days after the town hall. 60% of them were from people over 60. They weren't asking for anything. They were saying thank you. Thank you for doing the homework. Thank you for having the receipts. Thank you for not getting angry, for staying calm, for letting the evidence speak. One email from a retired school teacher in Ohio said simply, I spent 40 years being told I didn't know what I was talking about by people who'd never spent a day in a classroom. Watching you sit there with those documents and let him dig his own grave was the most satisfying thing I've seen in years. That was the product being delivered, though Crockett would never have described it that way. The bills, the amendments, the oversight questions, those were the work of governing. But the town hall, the documents, the calm dismantling of assumptions made by someone who'd built a career on never being caught unprepared, that was something else. That was the validation of everyone who'd ever been underestimated, everyone who'd done the work only to be told it didn't count, everyone who'd sat quietly while someone louder claimed authority they hadn't earned. The video wasn't just political commentary. It was a 2-hour demonstration that preparation beats performance, that documentation beats deflection, and that the person who looks weakest at the start of the confrontation isn't always the person who loses. Shapiro never mentioned the town hall again on his show. But 6 weeks later, when another host asked him about congressional effectiveness, his answer was noticeably more careful. He talked about the importance of both legislative output and oversight. He mentioned the value of committee attendance. He didn't name Crockett, but he didn't have to. Everyone who'd watched the exchange knew exactly why his analysis had suddenly become more nuanced. You can talk faster than someone can think, but you can't talk faster than someone who brought the documents. The 5 folders sat on Crockett's desk for weeks afterward, a reminder that had become a symbol. The bipartisan resolution, the appropriations amendment, the attendance records, the infrastructure language, the oversight transcripts, not performance art, not Instagram activism, not theater, just the documented, verifiable, irrefutable work of governing, the work that Shapiro said didn't exist right up until the moment she proved it did. And in that gap between his assumption and her evidence, the entire foundation of his critique collapsed. He'd come to lecture her on politics. She'd opened 5 documents. And by the time the town hall ended, the only person who needed a lesson was the one who thought he'd already mastered the subject.